Take your mind back with me, if you will, to the time of the Exodus as we studied last evening. In there we found a people who became a people. And at the essence of their nationhood and their birth as a nation, they came together as a needy group of complaining people, crying out for deliverance from slavery. And they witnessed 10 plagues. Things done to their captors, and they, on the other hand, are kept from these problems. One after one, the gods of Egypt are put on trial and found to be wanting. Yahweh, the one who met with Moses at the burning bush, has proved to be more powerful. And as they then come and travel through and they come against the Red Sea, here they have an opportunity to see, as they're afraid for their lives with a powerful army bearing down on them, kept back only by God Himself, placing Him in the way. And then they see what Moses says of the salvation of the Lord as the waters of the Red Sea part before their eyes. And they're able to walk across in dramatic fashion on dry ground. And so they were able to see the Lord provide for them all of these things. And immediately they get over. And all of a sudden what we have is we have water that's unfit to drink and it's made fit to drink. And they're hungry and they don't have anything, and God provides manna for food. And they come and they don't have any water at all, and He provides water from a rock. God has taken care of them in ways that they could never have imagined on their own. But then as they completed what was the original destination of their journey, and they come to Mount Horeb, they were confronted with something so tremendous they could not continue. For it was here that the Lord Himself appeared to them. Above this mountain, in a thick cloud, dense, rising up above, and at the same time with thunder and lightning flashing and the sound of a trumpet. The smoke went up before them in a funnel as they stood at the base of the mountain quaking, and the people likewise doing the same. They had already seen all these things, but at this moment something extraordinary happened. Of greater significance than all the plagues from the crossing of the Red Sea and all that they observed before this mountain in the valley. God spoke to His people, giving them law. Please open to Exodus chapter 20. And we note this in verse 1, where it says, "And God spoke all these words." I don't know that we appreciate this. We see it so often, we take it for granted. But to have been there, and this one that they had seen exert power and power and power again, to do marvelous works before them that no one could do. And now they are at the foot of the mountain and they see manifestations that are frightening. And then they hear Him. Not some dumb idol, meaning silent and has nothing that He can say, but a God of the greatest mind in existence, pouring out wisdom for them. The law revealed much to Israel, and as we're going to see, it still has much to say to us today as we consider it in principle. So let's look then, beginning at the verses 2 through 11, and notice this. It is through the law that God revealed Himself in requiring them to see Him in a particular way. Notice what it says. "I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them nor serve them. For I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children of the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you, nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. Notice, while we look at this as the first set within the 10 Commandments, but it's all about God. And he is telling them, he's introducing himself to them. Through the law, you see, it not only came from God, but at the heart of it, the law is about God too. And the opening demonstrates that. But notice what it says about him and what you learn. And from the very beginning, at the foot of Sinai, God cares for man because he introduces himself. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. God cares about you. I'm your deliverer. I'm your Savior. I'm the one who is there for you when no one was there for you. In Romans 6, verses 16 through 18, it says, Know ye not that to whom you yield yourselves service to obey, as servants you are, to whom you obey, whether of sin unto death, or of obedience unto righteousness? But God be thanked that you were the servants of sin, but have obeyed from the heart that form of doctrine which was delivered you. Being then made free from sin, you became the servants of righteousness. That is, you went from someone who treated you horribly and a taskmaster to being someone who wants you to do the right thing, is going to help you do the right thing. That's what our God does. And he was introducing himself from the very beginning. But also, you move on to verse 3, God, our God, deserves exclusive devotion. We don't get to just pick and choose what we do for God, or say, let's put him in with our groups and the other gods that we serve, but you shall have no other gods before me. I don't want to see them here. I don't want to see any other gods. In Matthew chapter 4, verse 10, Jesus, in answering why he would not bow down before Satan, he simply quotes from Deuteronomy, which we'll see is the second reading of the law, in Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 7. Thou shalt worship the Lord thy God, and him only shalt thou serve. This was establishing an exclusive relationship. When you are going to be God's people, you are his people and only his people. And that is to be reflected in everything you do, because this is who he is. He's not one of some vast number of gods. He's the one and true God. And therefore he deserves your one and only devotion in life. He is, notice verse 4, he's spirit. You see this by what he's emphasizing he's not. Don't go making a carved image. Don't go molding something. That's not who I am. And you know what? It is what all those other gods were. That's exactly what they were. It's kind of like you're in Egypt and you're going to have a calf, or you go around and you make it. Yeah, what do? You have to make it. God already exists. He doesn't need you to make him. You have some gold. Remember in the prophets, you're just going to kind of take half of it. We're going to cut it down and we're going to make it and fashion it and create it. And there's my God. Then you put the other half on the fire to warm you. You can't do that with God. You can't play with Jehovah God. He's not something you get to mold. He's the one who is there to mold you. In John 4, verse 24, it says, God is spirit. They that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. You have to recognize the very character and essence of who God is. That he is not something that is this world's creation. And therefore anything he does is not of this world either. And therefore you see in verses 5 and 6 that this God, Jehovah God, he has standards, because he's very particular about certain things, and we need to pay attention to it. You shall not bow down to them nor serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me, but showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. Do you notice that he is making particular distinctions both in behavior and what he will do based upon what we will do? He is showing there he has set standards. Why? Because this is the just God, the true God. He is the one who establishes justice, and just and right is he. John 12, verse 48, Jesus reveals further the extent of what this means. He that rejecteth me and receiveth not my words hath one to judge him. The word that I have spoken, the same shall judge him in that last day. Standards. You know, we're living in a postmodern age in which the very concept of standards is abhorrent to some people. You can't tell me I can't do that. No, I can't, but God can. And has. And has the right to. There are standards. There is right and wrong. And God sets it. He's revealed himself. And matter of fact, he can't do anything but that because that's who he is. He is something definite in character. And the law expresses the definition of his character for us to appreciate and respect and mold ourselves after. And because of this, beginning in verse 7, God deserves reverence. Remember the very nature when he says that you are to not to take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. And then in verse 8, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. In Psalm 89 and verse 7, it says that you are to reverence the Lord's name. You appreciate him and recognize that he alone has that kind of reverence. But that means a lot of things. You know, reverence, or do you revere them? The Jews claim to revere him. Do you honor him with your speech? To revere, we're talking about this, he's saying you don't treat me and my name as something common to toss around. Now, you may not think about it, but when someone is, it may be simply online and signing on their O-M-G. Well, you know what? When I find someone does something, I don't want someone throwing my initials out there either. That was a KWR thing to do. And people will do it with the great God without even thinking about it. We ought to honor him with our speech. Let no corrupt communication come out of our mouths. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29. As a matter of fact, in Leviticus chapter 22, verse 32, it's even more specific about it. But also with our time. When he says, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy, he's going all the way back to, of course, Genesis 1 and the establishment of it, as he then shows in the later verses. This is the foundation, but what is it? It's remembering what God has done. And this is his time. And God deserves our time. You know what we've gone to? We act like God ought to be happy when we give him any of our time. Well, I'm there every time the doors are open. 4 hours a week. Woo! That's a lot of your life to give, isn't it? The Jews, as you see, they acted like 1 day a week was a lot to give. Leviticus 26 verse 2, he says specifically that they were to show that day and recognize it and not profane it. In Ephesians chapter 5 verse 16 on the New Testament side, it says we are to redeem the time. That is all the time. You recognize and use your time for God as a whole, and there's a principle of you know who he is, and your life ought to reflect that in your time. Now, man has this tendency to lower God down, to confine God in our own little boxes where we can kind of control God. And then we reimagine God to fit our purpose. Now, think about how many people have this idea of God when you tell them, who do you think of as God? And they have an image of a kindly grandfather. That's reducing God. Or God, they want to strip of certain characteristics and only think of in the things that make them feel good. And there are some people that To my way of thinking, they imagine God as a young, warm puppy. Because that's what they want him to make them feel. Just feel so loved. Well, God certainly can do that, but it's on a much deeper level, and you're not going to understand that when that's your view of God. When we have a view of God where I get to just worship him and he's going to accept whatever I do. That's a very small God if he's listening to you. Who are you and why would you worship someone who's only going to do what you tell him to do? God has revealed himself for who he is. And my friends, we need to appreciate him for who he really is. Not someone we wish him to be, because that's always going to be flawed. Second of all, through the law, God revealed love. Now we're going to turn over to the second reading in Deuteronomy chapter 7. Because this is something that people don't often think about with the law. In Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 6 through 8. Moses, in giving the law the second time to that second generation, says, "For you are a holy people to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all peoples on the face of the earth. The Lord did not set his love on you, nor choose you, because you were more in number than any other people, for you were the least of all peoples. But because the Lord loves you, and because he would keep the oath which he swore to your fathers, the Lord has brought you out with a mighty hand and redeemed you from the house of bondage, from the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt." Many people seem to think that law and love cannot coexist. And yet you find here, specifically, notice, in the old law, that they surely can. God proved they can. Love, real love, came from God first. We love him because he first loved us. 1 John chapter 4 and verse 19. In Hosea chapter 11 and verse 1, here we find a statement, the latter portion that probably we're more familiar with. "When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son." I loved him. It was God's love first that made possible their becoming a people, that brought them out. God's love then serves as a model for how we should love. In Deuteronomy chapter 10, we look now at verses 18 and 19. "He administers justice for the fatherless and the widow, and loves the stranger, giving him food and clothing. Therefore, love the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt." Now notice this simple connection. God loved the stranger, therefore you love the stranger. God is the model for how we are to love in everything. The law then goes further than this and takes that same idea and it moves it beyond to a love for the neighbor as a prime principle of morality. Leviticus 19 verse 18. Love thy neighbor as thyself. And he then, later on that same chapter, extended it to the strangers in Leviticus 19 verse 34. And how amazing is it then that God has already said, love your neighbor as yourself, and that part of this is loving strangers. And it took Jesus in Luke 10, 25 through 37, in talking about the Good Samaritan, to explain to a Jew what that meant. It was already there, but hard hearts don't want to listen to love, not biblical love. And thus the law connects loving God with obedience. Now we go back to Deuteronomy 7, and now look at verse 9. Deuteronomy 7 and verse 9. We've looked at everything leading up to this, but notice now. Therefore know that the Lord your God, He is God, the faithful God, who keeps covenant and mercy for 1,000 generations with those who love Him and keep His commandments. From the very beginning and the giving of the law, they were tying together that love and obedience go hand in hand. In fact, it's interesting that we are commanded to love God. Now follow me now. We're commanded to love God, and therefore you must obey God to love God. Do you think that through? So now you look at chapter 11, verse 1 of Deuteronomy. Therefore, you shall love the Lord your God and keep His charge, His statutes, His judgments, and His commandments always. Verse 13, same chapter. And it shall be that if you earnestly obey my commandments, which I command you today, to love the Lord your God and serve Him with all your heart, with all your soul. And he continues there. So now you learn further that through your love for God, you obey God even more. What are we to do? You're commanded. Love God. What does love require of you? To obey God. What does obeying God command you to do? To love God. It builds on one another. The more you appreciate and originally coming down and realizing who God is, you do what He says. He says, you love me. And you give yourself over in the right kind of love. But that love motivates you then to obey Him more. And that fuels who you are, so that throughout your life you should be growing simultaneously in how much you love God and want to give your heart to Him, and how much you are obeying God because of who He is and how much you love Him. And they build and feed one another, so that in the end they are so intertwined that no one that knows you can tell where the line between them is, because there shouldn't be one. That's the love of the law. When Jesus was asked what the greatest commandment given in the law was, He didn't hesitate. He responded quickly. Love. Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 and following, the Shema. The Lord our God, the Lord is one. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, with all thy strength. Jesus then says, this is the first and great commandment. In Matthew chapter 22. Verses 37 and following. And the second is like unto it, that thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Oh, and now we've tied that morality back to our love for God. And it's all about the right kind of love. On these two hang the law and the prophets. It's not love, 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 however I want to define it. It is love as God has put in His law to explain to us, here's what love is. That is the love that this is all about, and that we better fill our hearts with. This is then not some shallow, fleeting emotion. It's a deep love of lifelong commitment. That doesn't take out and negate emotion, though, my friends. This is the one who brought us out of bondage. There better be some emotion there. But we do not throw reason out, because without reason, we do not realize how much God has done. The God who gave the law is the same loving God who sent Jesus, and they both proclaim His love. Thirdly, through the law, God revealed morality. This is surely what most people think of when they think of the Ten Commandments. And so there can be no doubt that the law stands as this foundational treatise on morality. It's all about morality, and people know that. That's why they don't want the Ten Commandments anywhere. I don't have to do that. It establishes firmly the existence of right and wrong for us in day-to-day living, and it designates the differences clearly. You can't get around those. But this is not some arbitrary list of do's and don'ts. Someone coming up and saying, well, I think we'll do this or that. No. The morality of the law is a natural extension of both God Himself as revealed and the nature of real love. This is God. He builds on who He is, the first commandments. And this is then going to find expression in love toward others in the last set of the commandments, as what we're going to see. The first 4 commandments focus on loving God properly, what that means. But the last 6 commandments, beginning in verse 12, they focus on loving mankind properly. Now notice what he's going to point out. We'll go through in a moment. But we're going to do it a different way. We're going to read them as they are, but I want you to see them a little bit different way, because what you ought to be learning and what they were supposed to be learning from this. We don't appreciate that what he was really doing was establishing positive principles of morality. Now, he was giving this as a moral code in terms of civil law too. That's part of it and why he says it in this way. But it was founded in principles he's going to be developing later that are positive principles that he expected them to implement as well. That's why in Romans chapter 13, verses 8 through 10, in the context of the law and a discussion on that and civil law, he says, oh, no man anything but to love one another, and then goes down and talks about loving your neighbor as yourself. What does he then mean by this? What are the positive principles here? Verse 12, he says, honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the earth, which the Lord your God is giving you. The Apostle Paul quotes that in Ephesians chapter 6, 2 and 3. Appreciate what your parents have done for you. Always. That's such a simple sentence to say. But there are people who have a real hard time with it. Appreciate, honor, value what your parents have done. Well, you just don't know my parents. How'd you get here, son? You exist because of your parents. There are a lot of things parents do. They provide, they guide, and no, they're not going to do it perfectly. But there needs to be an appreciation for what they do that's right. Verse 13, you shall not murder. Value human life, period. Now, if you think I'm going too far with this, let's go over Matthew chapter 5, 21 and 22 and see what Jesus said they should have learned from this. You've heard it said to you, thou shalt not murder. He who murders shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say unto you, do not be angry with your brother, for you shall be in danger of the judgment. What? And you go on and talk about what they were doing, or say rocketted, or thou fool. Why? You are devaluing another human being. And violence against a human being in murder is the ultimate expression of the attitude that begins by acting like some other human being with a soul isn't as important as you are. And that includes little babies in the womb. Or some older person who can't think as well as they used to be able to. It's interesting how we can decide, the humans want to decide who has value. And none of them seem very interested to have someone consider that they don't have as much value. They always come from the point of view of that pride of life, that I have value. Why else would they speak? We need to value all human life. And trying to overvalue animal life doesn't help that. Treat marriage, verse 14, as a God-given covenant, not a government-issued contract. You shall not commit adultery. If we're going to reduce it to where it is just paper, then we have belittled God's institution. Remember Genesis 2? We belittle it by saying it's just a piece of paper. It doesn't really matter. Leviticus 21 and verse 7, when it came to the priests, remember we're priests today if we're Christians, but his priest, he didn't want them going anywhere close to that. There were allowances made under the law, but the principle Jesus brings out in Matthew chapter 19 verse 6, what God had joined together, let not man put asunder. We have to treat it seriously. Verse 15, you shall not steal. Positive principle. If you want something, work for it. Matter of fact, if you go to Ephesians chapter 4 verse 28, when he says, let him who stole steal no longer, but let him work with his hands so that he may give. There's a turnaround. Don't be the person who's taking things, you be the person who can give things. Why? Because work is valuable. Adam was told to work before sin ever came into the garden. He was put in the garden to tend and keep it. Because work is valuable to us and for us. Verse 16, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. Now that's a court proceeding. And again, we're talking civil law to some degree. Principle, always tell the truth. And it shouldn't require your hand on a Bible to make you do it. Let everyone speak the truth with his neighbor. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 25. And now look at verse 17. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. Now, Paul in Romans 7 would just simply call that, thou shalt not covet. Jesus did the same thing too. You think about what is the opposite, though, Everyone wants to spend their time on, well, what exactly is covetous and coveting versus being jealous, and we spend all the time on that. Let's spend some more time thinking about what the opposite of covetousness is. Contentment. Being content with what you have. Notice the whole thing is wanting something that's not yours. How do you avoid that entirely? Be content with what you have. I have found in whatever state I am therewith to be content. Paul said in Philippians chapter 4, verse 11, in telling people to stop sending as much support as they were, because other people could use it, while he was in prison, be content. So God showed that loving your fellow man begins, notice, verse 12, in the home. There's a reason why I started there. And then it extends from there out to all mankind, and therefore to their property. These are true because they're based on the eternal character of God, which is why he starts there. And that's not going to change. Why? Malachi 3 verse 6, I am the Lord, Yahweh, I change not. And therefore neither do these principles of morality, and which is why in principle those principles are in the new too. Number 4, through the law, God revealed holiness. In Exodus chapter 3 and verse 5, Moses has come before the Lord, the burning bush, and he is told, take off his sandals, for you are on holy ground. Now that was not the best dirt in the world. That is not the point. He was before the holy God, and that made the ground he was on holy. Later on in chapter 19 and verse 12, the same thing would apply when the people as a whole are before that mountain. You know, today we can marvel when reading all the details of the law and its exacting nature. But through the law, God revealed holiness. That's what he's doing. We look askance at all these regulations. You say, why is that? Why do I have to read that? All these distinctions between what was clean, what was not clean. We have trouble sometimes trying to figure out what animals he's talking about. And we fail to appreciate that this was training for accepting the distinctions God gave, especially as that would apply spiritually. There are some things that are clean. There are some things that are not clean. You stay with the clean. Now, there were other reasons why those were given. There were health reasons. There were plenty of other reasons that were practical. But he was training them here. All of this was designed for Israel to learn to maintain a sharp line of distinction between what God would accept and what he wouldn't. Holiness. And so when Nadab and Abihu, having been consecrated, treated as holy, offer up, the word is profane fire. What's profane? We always think that just with words. Treated as common. Here's what had happened with them. They made the mistake of thinking that when they were consecrated, that their holiness because of that meant they could do what they wanted. And everything they did became holy. Instead of realizing that consecration means I have a greater responsibility to do only that which is holy. Are you listening, my friends? That's Leviticus 10, 3 and 4. Holiness means setting yourself apart from common conduct to conduct yourself in a way that reflects the character of God, because he's holy. Leviticus chapter 11, verse 44 and 45. Notice the foundation for this. For I am the Lord your God, you shall therefore consecrate yourselves. That means make holy. And you shall be holy, for I am holy. Neither shall you defile yourselves with any creeping thing that creeps on the earth. For I am the Lord who brings you up out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall therefore be holy, for I am holy. In Ephesians chapter 4, verse 1, it is stated in a different way, but with a similar intent. You are to walk worthy of the vocation with which you were called. Live up to the God and the message that called you. God's distinctiveness, what makes him different, is due to his essential character. He is distinct as transcending spirit. And therefore, we need to learn to think in terms of the spiritual. You know, they had a hard time with idolatry and did until they came back out of Babylonian captivity. Why? Because it's so easy to get caught up in the tangible. But what are we supposed to be doing? To lift ourselves beyond this and to realize this is not real. God is real. This is going away. It's temporary, and that is eternal. And I need to think on a realm that goes beyond the obvious. It goes beyond just the visible. That goes beyond what I can see easily and to see in the mind's eye what God has told me. God is also distinct in His love. Why? Because God is love. 1 John chapter 4 and verse 5 or 8. What do we find there? If you want to know what love is, you need to know who God is and how God loves. Judge not that you be not judged, preacher. Does God ever judge? Yes. Is God love? Yes. Then that means that there can be judgment even from someone who loves. Let's not get confused, and instead let's look at how God judges and point to the judgment of the one who indeed has loved us more than we love ourselves sometimes. But He's also distinct as the standard of truth, and that's why He also judges. In 1 John chapter 1, verses 5 through 7, it says God is light, and in Him is no darkness at all. If we say that we have fellowship with Him and walk in darkness, we lie and do not the truth. Notice that connection, standard. But if we walk in the light, truth expressed, as He is in the light, we have fellowship one with another, and the blood of Jesus Christ His Son cleanses us from all sins. Did God's love go away just there? Or was it there all the time? Here's the standard, God. What is the standard expressing? Truth. What does that mean? You walk in the light as God is. What makes that possible and meaningful? Because I've sinned. The blood of Christ. Because God's also love, and Jesus was given as a propitiation, 1 John chapter 4 and verse 9. This is what sets Him apart from man and from anything else called God. Exodus 15, verse 11. This is what they had already expressed. Moses, they've come through and they recognized when they came through the Red Sea, who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, glorious in holiness, fearful in praises, doing wonders? God highlighted holiness by the required sanctification of everything to be used in the tabernacle when you get to Exodus 30, 29, and 30. There was a process by which it was set aside and said, this is holiness. This is what it means to be different. The Ark of the Covenant, the implements to be used with it, the oil and the incense. Friends, He was going on and said, the recipe's holy. Don't use it any other way. The garments that the priests were to wear, holy. The days were holy. The sacrifices, holy. Leviticus chapter 8, 10 through 12. And these therefore were all to be treated as special. That means used for nothing else but God's purposes. Exodus 30, verses 25 through 38. That's why I didn't want them using the recipe. This is for me. Be ye holy, because I am holy, saith the Lord. Holiness includes being set apart for the Lord's service. In Exodus chapter 39, 30 and 31, what do we find here but Him putting together in what is going to be the turban? And they've made something special for this and for the priest. And there was a plate. And on it was etched, holiness to the Lord, set apart for His purposes, to be used for Him as He wishes. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 11. But ye are washed, baptized. Ye are sanctified, consecrated, or made holy. Ye are justified, right with the law. Holiness should be our greatest aspiration as people. Because holiness is what it takes to be in God's presence. Leviticus 22, 1 through 3, and talking about those priests. And everything had to be holy just for them to enter the holy place. And he had to be consecrated and offer one sacrifice the high priest did when he entered just for himself, so he could dare enter to offer it for everyone else in the most holy place. What then would we expect that we should aspire to for those who want to go into God's true presence in holy place, the holiest of holies, heaven. It's the willingness to conform to his holiness, then, that makes his people today, the church, distinct. Exodus 19, verse 6. He calls them a holy nation. In 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 9, talking to the church, the Apostle Peter says, "But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation." We are his own special people. Israel was. The church is now. Number 5. Through the law, God revealed justice. We return in thinking to Exodus 32 and verse 4 that just and right is he. He's a God of justice. The law served as both the moral code and the legal code for Israel. And guess what? Sometimes that can be confusing, and it surely confused them. Because a lot of times they treated the moral code as if it was the legal code, and the legal code is the moral code. Whatever suited the purpose at the time, I guess. But now, there are principles we ought to realize. Deuteronomy chapter 10. The law established that justice and morality go hand in hand. Now, there's a novel idea for today's world, isn't it? Notice what he says here. Deuteronomy 10, beginning in verse 17. For the Lord your God is God of gods and Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality nor takes a bribe. He administers justice for the fatherless and the widow and loves the stranger, giving him food and clothing. You notice what he then combined? God is being just and giving law and moral principles that follow. And everyone today, what do they want to say? You can't legislate morality. You know, I'm going to agree with that. You can't. God already has. And you better not mess with it. You don't legislate morality, but you'd better legislate morally. Because anybody in office is accountable to God for what they do in office too. God sets what's right and wrong. God sets what the way to go. And it could be a king. It could be a president and a Congress and a Supreme Court. It doesn't matter which way it is, whoever's in power has a responsibility to legislate morally. The law established that justice means following the standard, not personal preference. You don't get to just do whatever you like, Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 18 says. Why? Because there's a standard there. That's how there's justice. If there's no standard, there's no such thing as justice. You ever thought about that? Everyone wants social justice, and the same people who want social justice don't want any moral standards. So now we don't have standards by which we can judge whether or not something is just or not. John 17, verse 17, God didn't leave us in that predicament. Sanctify them through thy truth. Thy word is truth. How do you be holy? How do you be right? How do you know what the right things to do? God tells you. The law established that justice should be blind to prejudice of all kinds. Don't take a bribe. You don't do that. You have a higher responsibility than to yourself. Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 19. Why? Because you're judging according to a standard that is set by God. That's why. The law established that justice exists to protect the righteous and condemn the wicked. Why is that so hard for people to understand? Paul reiterated that point in Romans chapter 13. That's the purpose of law, of government. Deuteronomy 25:1. You see, behold the goodness and severity of God. Romans chapter 11, verse 22. And it was all according to whether or not you followed the law. Meaning whatever he legislated as being truth. His will. The law was perfect for its purpose, the old law. As Galatians chapter 3, verse 24 says. But it had a limited purpose. And it ensured justice as long as being trusted in the Lord's judgment rather than their own, which in ancient Israel wasn't very often. It's this failure that plagued Israel. And that failure is what plagues our society today. We don't want to go back and look at right and wrong to establish what we're doing in society. And society's a mess. And what do? We decide to make more of a mess of society so perhaps people won't notice the last mess we made. Number 6. Through the law, God revealed the cost of sin. Don't leave that out. Hebrews chapter 9, verse 22, remember, is discussing the nature of the law in its faults as well. But he says a principle here. Without the shedding of blood, there is no remission. One of the most frequently occurring words in the law is a simple one: blood. Go back and check. When Israel left Egypt, they began by placing blood on the doorposts and the lintels of their homes. Exodus chapter 12, verse 7. God wanted blood there. When the people accepted the covenant at Sinai, Moses sprinkled the people symbolically with blood. Exodus chapter 24, 6 through 8. Why? Because they were accepting the covenant. Yes, we will do what he says to do. Okay, we're sealing it with blood. Blood sanctified the altar in Exodus 29, verses 12 through 16. It sanctified the priests and their garments in Exodus 29, 20 and 21. This is special. This is for God. Blood was part of every offering designed to forgive sins, recorded in Leviticus 1 through 9. Not every offering, but a burnt offering, sin offering, you're going to shed some blood. Blood ceremonially cleansed people. Think, why do you come back and you're going to be cleansed of something that made you dirty, and you're going to do this by putting blood on you? That really confused me when I was young. How does blood make you clean? The answer ultimately is found in the New Testament. He's setting us up for it now. Blood was essential for atonement. Leviticus 16, verse 27. On the Day of Atonement we went in, there had to be the shedding of blood. Blood was special for a simple reason that the law also noted in Leviticus 17, verse 11, because life is in the blood. We use that statement to talk about the scientific foreknowledge of the Bible, the recognition that, during the days and long before the days in which they were still cutting people and letting them bleed and thinking that was a good treatment for them. Yeah. But life being in the blood goes a lot deeper than that. It is this final connection that makes everything in the law make sense, including, by the way, the requirement not to eat blood. Blood represents life, and this is what sin has cost man. The wages of sin is death. Romans chapter 6, verse 23. This is why when men sinned, the law said, their blood shall be upon them. Guilt, life, death. Leviticus 20, verse 9, verse 11, verse 12, verse 13, verse 16, verse 27. You think there's a theme developing? And so you move forward to Matthew chapter 27 and verse 25. And the people are arguing with Pontius Pilate, who doesn't want to do anything with Jesus but let him go. And the people said, let his blood be upon us. Therefore, for man to be redeemed from death and made God's people, there also had to be blood. But despite the high quality and high quantity that was required of these sacrifices, go back sometimes when they did offer them, at the thousands of sacrifices that were shed at one time. And think about how much blood that meant. It wasn't enough. And all throughout their time, from the time they're at Sinai all the way moving forward, it wasn't enough. Why? Because in Hebrews chapter 10, verse 4, it says, the blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sin. It's never going to be enough. Our sin cost the blood of God's own Son. That's the cost of our sin. For you are not redeemed with corruptible things, as silver and gold received. It says by vain, to redeem you, it says from vain tradition received by your fathers. But with the precious blood of Jesus Christ, without spot, without blemish. That is, as the proper kind of sacrifice that God will accept. I cannot imagine what it must have been to have been there on that day at the foot of the mountain with all the noise, the sound, the sight before me. Quaking. And hearing God speak. And yet the people failed to appreciate it time and time again. The very ones who were there. So after 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, this second generation prepares to enter the promised land. Once more, Moses promised to speak to them, and he pointed them back to the law. Before you go in, before I leave you, you're going to hear this. And in that law, he also revealed one more thing, the nature of man. Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 19 and 20, in which as he is pulling everything together about what this law means for them, he wants to make sure they understand what it means about them too. I call heaven and earth as witnesses today against you that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, choose life, that both you and your descendants may live, that you may love the Lord your God, that you may obey his voice, that you may cling to him, for he is your life and the length of your days, and that you may dwell in the land which the Lord swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them. The nature of man is we have to choose to follow, to listen, to do. At this point, there was so much still to come in the history of Israel and their relationship with God. But just from the story of the law, Israel learned that they had a choice to make. And they'd have to accept the consequences of that choice. The message of the law was rich and it was powerful. But it could not provide an answer for our weakness, for our failure, for our sin. But God knew that too. That's why he sent Jesus. He knew that that couldn't work. He knew that that was not what man really needed. It was to get us to the point as mankind where we could get what we needed. And so God, who spoke to Moses, took on human form. He was made in the likeness of men, Philippians chapter 2, 6 through 8. Why? To suffer death for us and to deliver us from the one who had the power of death, that is, the devil. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 14. To give us victory, 1 Corinthians 15, verse 57. To give his blood so that we can be cleansed as the perfect sacrifice, Hebrews 7, 26 and 27. And while the law was imperfect and could not reveal all that was needed, Jesus, having offered that perfect sacrifice of himself, having been raised the third day victoriously, and having ascended to heaven to enter the holiest place of all, sent the Holy Spirit to the apostles to give them the gospel to fill that void. For I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For therein is the righteousness of God revealed. That's an important word there. It's not hidden away any longer. I'm making it known. From faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith. What you've needed all along, here it is. You needed Jesus. You needed the church. You needed the blood. And now you have it. You have a message that says, listen. Listen to God. Not to men. And respond to him, Romans 10:17. Trust, not men, but God and Jesus. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 6. Change your life, not your God. Change to conform to the only true God and his will. Acts 17:30. State your allegiance to God and this one who died for you. Romans 10:9 and 10 through your confession. And you need the blood. And that's why you need to be buried with him into his death. Romans chapter 6, 3 and 4. So that now you can rise to walk in newness of life. There you find forgiveness. There you find cleansing, because there in baptism is where you find Jesus. We are now blessed to have everything we need from God. We know what we need to know. We have the sacrifice that we need to have. We have the Savior we need most of all. This is the story of the law. God has spoken. And therefore, it is imperative that we listen. The message is there for you in the gospel. Are you listening? If so, you need Won't you please come while we stand and sing?
While we pray.